President Jair Bolsonaro is preparing a project known as the National Fertilizer Plan. The measure uses a Russian-Ukrainian conflict as an excuse to invade indigenous lands and open those territories to mining. More details are in the following report.
Of Dilma Rousseff, Petrobras closed and privatized fertilizer plants as part of its disinvestment policy. Fafen, the main producer of nitrogenates, closed in 2020 during the government of Jair Bolsonaro. In this context, Brazil imports 85% of fertilizers, out of which 23% from Russia. The fertilizer most used by agribusiness is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. On this regard, Bolsonaro has avoided talking about the closure of nitrogen plants by focusing instead on potassium. 80% of the world's potassium reserves depend on Russia, Belarus, and Canada. This whole discussion about potassium is just to mask the mismanagement of nitrogen fertilizers. Those should be left to us to produce in the hands of Brazilians, just like in Venezuela, because we have oil and gas, so we can produce them. But in order to bypass the real issue, his incompetence in this regard, he'd rather focus on potassium. Before the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out, Bolsonaro, at the request of the agribusiness, asked Vladimir Putin to keep supplying fertilizers, but with the escalation of the conflict, the Russian Ministry of Industry and Trade advises companies not to export fertilizers. Faced with imminent shortages, Bolsonaro is seeking to decree a national fertilizer plan that contemplates mineral exploitation on indigenous lands, which would be unconstitutional. Bolsonaro had already been insisting on all this. Bolsonaro in 2020 sent to the National Congress his Bill 191. In that bill, he already contemplated the regularization of mining in indigenous lands. This is one of the main political proposals with which Bolsonaro becomes president of the Republic. From day one, he's been working to make this a reality in the country. In 2021 and 2022, he has asked the National Congress to make Bill 191 a priority. All this was before the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. The president claims that without fertilizers, there will be a shortage of produce. However, in 2021, agribusiness made record profits in the export of raw materials, whereas more than half of the Brazilian population did not have adequate access to food supplies. Now he's got one more excuse, a valid excuse. The Ukrainian-Russian conflict, the impact on indigenous peoples would be tragic. It would mean making the life of indigenous peoples practically unviable. According to the Ministry of Agriculture, the supply of fertilizers will last until October, but the National Adobo Association says it would only last until June. Meanwhile, the indigenous people are preparing for an escalation of attacks by the Bolsonaro administration.
Ignacio Lemus y Julian Asif para TeleSUR.